She'd been gone longer than her parents had expected. As soon as the door creaked open, they rushed toward her like predators, snapping their teeth and holding out their hands. But Monica, as she crossed the threshold and walked past her mother and father as if they were strangers trying to take something valuable out of her pockets, did not hear a single question from them. Instead, only sighs were heard. She walked quickly to the fireplace in the center of the room, as if a little more delay might destroy her. But she didn't sit down. She leaned toward the fire, hands at her sides. She knew she would. She could feel their questions, like the dirt that clung to her brown hair and heavy shirt and pants, staining them a dull greenish hue. She could hear their thoughts, their opinions, their judgments before they even uttered a word. And she was certain that reality would prove far worse than her imagination. No matter how perfect her parents, Father Frank and Mother Hilary, seemed, they weren't ready for today. If they had thought they had already given her enough guidance, today they were in for a real climax. The fire crackled, and the smoke rose in thin streams to the wooden walls, decorated with furs and heads of wild beasts, giving the room a coziness unavailable to many castles, even those like Darkly. Monica wished that the sound of fire was the only thing she would ever hear again. She made a decision. No more talking to her parents or listening to them. Almost every day went the same way. They talked, but never heard her. Perhaps it was like that for all parents with children. Children rarely had words worth listening to, especially when they were full of whims and fantasies far from reality. But Monica was no longer a child. She had thought that parents would listen more when their children were older. But how cruelly wrong she had been. The thought had visited her before and resurfaced again, as the shadows from the fire lay on the walls. If only parents could sew on an extra ear as one of their trophies, she would have no problem getting them to listen. On the other hand, she had never been particularly adept at communicating with her parents, nor, for that matter, had many of her peers. Who's to say that even if she had the ability to keep a conversation going, she'd be able to do so on a level? Most likely it would have come down to one-word phrases and high-flown answers. They had gotten her to this state. But just how bad was it really? Monica shook her head, then glanced over her shoulder, first at her mother, then at her father, and then at the floor in front of his shoes. Frank was the first one out of the house, as Hilary slowly closed the door. Here comes the silence, Monica thought, feeling tears come to her eyes and her heart begin to clench. Oh, it's about to start. Hilary stared at the charred and scratched door, holding onto it tightly, as if hoping it would absorb some of her emotions, or at least sustain her when her strength waned. It was pointless to count how many times a day she did this, especially in moments of anxiety or upset. And Monica suspected that right now her mother was experiencing both. Her father had long ago given up trying to understand or correct her behavior, and Monica was close to giving up, too. When Frank's boots clattered loudly on the dirty floorboards, Monica turned back to the fire. One of her soiled hands touched her lips, two dirty fingers and thumb were in her mouth, and her nails slid across her teeth. Feeling the disgusting taste of dirt, she pulled her hand out in horror and shoved it into her pocket. She heard her father lift his mug from the table behind her and take a long sip. The stubble of his mustache ruffled around the rim of the cup like a broomstick. Even after he had sipped, the quiet rustling could still be heard. He'd been doing it since she was a child. Her father had said it helped him think in moments when all he was required to do was ponder. If she'd had the chance to shave off that damn mustache a long time ago, maybe she'd have avoided all those grunts that came off his naked lips. The fire crackled, and a spark fell on her hand. But she didn't even move. Just a little pain, Monica thought. Just a little pain. That's all I deserve. Though maybe even that's not enough. She heard the chair behind her creak. Her father pushed it away from the table. When he lowered himself into the chair, there was an agonizing creak of warped wood. He always sat in that old chair. After dinner, and sometimes until the wee hours of the morning, her father would spend hours immersed in his thoughts, driving his mustache around the rim of his mug. The chair now conjured up more associations with him than her father himself, and even smelled like him. and sometimes better. Monica didn't need to turn around to realize her mother was still standing at the door. She often fantasized about what her parents would do if they came home and didn't find the door or the chair, or both at once. But those thoughts never ended on anything good. 5 was how many there were. The bristly scraping stopped. Monica didn't know why, but her skin was covered in goosebumps, though it wasn't cold or scary, and she did nothing but wish for silence by the crackling fireplace. "There's still left if you get hungry," Frank muttered, as if each word was given to him with an effort like a stabbing. Monica's jaw quivered, and finally she couldn't stand it any longer, tears streaming down her face. She had managed to hold back until now, not because she was stronger or less shaken than the others, but because there was too much to process. Tears were a luxury she couldn't afford. She stared into the fire, leaning closer as the mud and silt fell from her like rotten rain. She caught the soft rustle of her mom's shoes. Hillary left faster than usual today. Sometimes her mother forgot to eat, and Monica, or Frank, had to bring her food right to the door. It was all the 3 of them could do to survive and maintain their modest existence. Frank liked his job better than his time at home, so he wasn't a problem. Monica, on the other hand, was making good money guarding a local group of kids, as good as could be expected in the slums of Copper City. It was certainly better than many of the other jobs women her age were forced to take for nearly the same pay. But Hillary was the weak link in the family. Her moods changed daily. Some days she was the same, calm and composed, but other days it was useless to try to talk to her, let alone work or meet her. The fire flared up again. Monica stared at the fire through her tears, not noticing another spark falling on her. She was standing too close to the hearth, but she didn't back away. "Not hungry, are you?" Frank muttered, fidgeting in his chair, and his chair groaned again under the weight of his body. Monica almost threw herself into the fire when she felt her mother's hand on her shoulder. She hadn't heard her footsteps. "Why don't you change your clothes?" Hillary asked. "Take a bath." Her mother's voice sounded distant and uncertain, as if she was speaking from the top of the city wall and Monica was far below. The tone reminded her of the way they discussed insignificant things, like the fact that it had been cooler in the last century in the fall. Monica had no particular hatred for her parents. Everyone had their struggles, their flaws and weaknesses that got in the way of being perfect, but she hated it when her parents showed indifference in the face of something important that required not just attention, but meticulous attention. And as she'd anticipated, their reaction was worse than she'd imagined. Her father offered her a stew, and her mother spoke, if they were only casual acquaintances. Her tears came even harder. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became that she hated not one but 2 of their indifference. "Fire won't dry the tears," Frank muttered, blowing air through his mustache, "and it won't put them out either." A third groan from the chair gave away that it had leaned back. Hillary quickly removed her hand from Monica's shoulder, disappearing as suddenly as she had appeared. Monica didn't even need to turn around to realize her mother had gone to get a bucket of water. Behind her she heard the clinking of bowls and the thud of spoons as her father dutifully devoured the stew that was about to cool. The sound of his efforts was as if he were trying to dig out something better from the bottom of the bowl, as if there was some better food hidden there that he wanted to get. Hillary rummaged through the kitchen, turning over pots and scraping through pans, as if looking for something important, though the bucket of water was in plain sight. She said the mess calmed her down and reduced the noise in her head. Monica always thought that was just an excuse for not cleaning and getting rid of unnecessary things. Chug, 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 chug. The warmth and light from the fire began to fade, and every sound of clinking dishes and the clinking of spoons against plates overrode the soft crackle of the fire. Suddenly Monica felt a sharp pain in her stomach. She clutched at it with both hands, feeling the urge to gag, but suppressed it. Better to die than let it happen now. An unusual feeling swept over her, as if she had become a shore that furious waves were besieging relentlessly, or she had been lifted by her feet and shaken out like an old rug. She couldn't understand exactly what had happened, but something inside had clearly been lost, and it felt as if it had been replaced by something else. There were no clear signs or explanations of what was happening to her. All they could do was recount what they had heard from the deceased neighbor. That didn't bode well. Especially frightening were the little things that were left unsaid. Uncertainty was what was most frightening. Chug, 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 chug. A sharp pain pierced behind her eye, making Monica shriek to herself, and she bit her lip, holding back a groan. The fire was dying down, and darkness began to gradually envelop the house. Chug, 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 chug. Monica turned sharply, staring angrily at the lumbering figure of her father, who sat slouching at the table. In one swift movement, she strode toward him and knocked the table over. The clatter of dishes and the clinking of shattering plates echoed through the room as cups and plates ended up on the floor, and the Stu learned for the first time what it meant to be out of the bowl. Frank didn't move. Monica stood over him, breathing heavily, hands clenched into fists that trembled slightly. He still had the spoon in his hand, with the stew liquid dripping slowly from the edge. Only now did she smell the dish. Before that, her sense of smell had been paralyzed by the horrible stench that enveloped her from all sides. Come to think of it, why hadn't they said a word about the smell? I mean, they must have smelled it. Probably even those further down the street had already started looking for a dead animal, crushed under the wheels or trapped somewhere in a crevice of the house. A new wave of pain was about to come, and she berated herself for wishing it only a moment ago. Sure, the thought hadn't seemed so bad before, when she'd been in control of the situation, when standing so close to the fire had been her choice. But now that the pain could come at any moment, unpredictably and powerfully, Monica was completely knocked out. All that was left was a craving for her life to be over, but at the same time, she was restrained by the oblivion and despair that penetrated her as deeply as the sticky mud on her clothes. Hilary finally returned with a bucket and brush, setting them at Monica's feet. Frank, meanwhile, shoved his spoon into his mouth, licking the remains of the stew thoroughly. Come on, you better wash up before you sit down to eat, Hilary said quietly, wiping her hands on her sleeves. Monica looked at her mother, straightened, gritted her teeth. Her face and neck were burning like a boiling kettle. It was only because she was looking directly at her that Monica noticed that Hilary was crying. Quietly, silently, but there were tears. Monica looked over at her father. He was crying too, the spoon still in his mouth. Don't worry about your father and me, Hilary said quietly, gently touching Monique's dirty cheek. You did the right thing coming home. Frank chewed on his spoon, avoiding meeting Monica's gaze, his eyes fixed on the chaos on the floor she'd made. She's right. He rose slowly from his chair and walked leisurely toward the corner of the room where their bed stood. Monica wanted to say something, but her mouth was frozen and her tongue felt sluggish and heavy. Her eyes rounded, and her hands began to twitch, entwining with each other like a snake coiling its rings. Hilary leaned over to the bucket next to her and dipped the brush into the cool water. Monica bent forward, and her mother began rubbing her dirty head with the wet brush, but the sticky mud wouldn't give up, as if ignoring this watery stream, and Monica clenched, wrapping her arms around her belly, where she could feel the tearing knots. Her teeth clattered, and her tongue began to bleed from how hard she bit down on it. Blood dripped like hammer blows on red-hot iron. We're all going to the stars, Hilary whispered softly as she continued to brush her daughter's head and back. Everything strong breaks one day. From the opposite corner of the room, where Frank was standing, came a faint sound like the rustling of falling leaves being driven carelessly down the street by the wind. The fire in the hearth was dying out, its faint glow illuminating the room for the last few moments before the house was plunged into darkness. Monica jerked away from her mother's arms, waving her hand into the void as if trying to push away an invisible enemy. A mumble caught in her throat, and only a faint sound escaped her bloody lips. Her heel accidentally caught a cup that rolled aside, and Monica staggered and fell onto the overturned table. A loud rumble echoed through the room, scattering dishes into the corners. Hilary stood motionless, barely moving, with a dirty brush in her hands. Green water and mud dripped slowly from her brush onto the floor. Monica shrieked and gave a convulsive cough. She collapsed onto her arm, which was bent unnaturally and apparently broken. Her belly was bloating and her eyes were filled with streams of frozen green mucus mixed with the mud that covered her body. Her body wriggled and shuddered and thrashed about on the floor, breaking bones one by one. The darkness finally enveloped the room when there was the sound of steel being pulled from its sheath. Then quick, heavy footsteps, Monica's scream, followed by Hilary's desperate cry.